getting less food.
Hello. Today we're going to start a new section on, I believe, world order. What do you think of that, Belinda? Should we delve into world order?
I think so. I think it seems to be very apparent.
I suppose I should begin by saying what I mean by world order. I'm not quite sure where this will go today, but it's just a general inspiration, because we hear phrases like New World Order, and there's all the emotion around that. And a lot of people fear it, and there are good reasons to be dubious about any kind of world governance that is imposed upon us from above by the power elite. You only have to go to the internet to see the fears and concerns that people have about institutions like the World Economic Forum that meets at Davos, to understand that world order is going to be automatically associated with some kind of nefarious new world order or system of planetary bondage and complete surveillance that has been in the works, prepared for a long time, since George Bush Sr., the US president, mentioned it, dropped the phrase New World Order in a speech, and other presidents have since. Not to mention the Klaus Schwabs and the Davos group. We even had a health official use the phrase New World Order here during the COVID pandemic.
I remember that.
Mm-hmm. I'm not talking about that, and I don't want to get into this in an emotive way. I'm not here to polarize an audience. There's plenty of material out on the net which is aimed at polarizing an audience, and I'm not attacking or even disparaging it, because when it comes to politics and geopolitics, people like to take sides. They like to be on a team and complain about things. So, is it possible to contemplate world order and possibly the emergence of a new world order without that new world order necessarily being seen as good or bad, but just a world order that's coming? Why is it plausible that a new world order is coming? Well, for the simple reason that we've never really had a coherent world order or global order, because the world hasn't been sufficiently developed in its interconnectedness and in its just its general interrelationships, technology and so on. so that the different states of the world, the different nation states, have to some degree or other been living wild, living in a state of nature, as it were, to some extent. And so there's a level of anarchy between the different peoples of the world in relation to one another. So the international relations theorists talk about different approaches, different perspectives to understanding world order. And in the realist perspective, which is receiving a lot of attention on the internet at the moment, especially with political scientists like John Mearsheimer, I think from the University of Chicago, being featured. There is the idea that the different nation states will ultimately act in their own power interests, because there's nothing really firm enough and compelling enough in the governance and institutional architecture between the nation states that has the clout to install an order that is at once just and representative for the whole world. So you have the realist school that believes that ultimately we have to understand nations as engaging. And the question of nations is problematic because the evolution of a nation has a history. There are some peoples that are more attached to the idea of the nation state as a basic union, as a basic unit, than other peoples. The nation state is a peculiarly European creation, really. It comes from the period after the Reformation and the formation of modern Europe. And in particular, the Treaty of Westphalia, which was aimed at putting an end to conflict after the wars of religion in Europe. It was signed in 1648. And so there was a system of order that's still a big inspiration today for another school of international relations called the Westphalian School. And this school posits nation states that can enter into agreements and understandings with each other, and they are supported therein by institutions that are transnational, international, or global, like the United Nations, and spin-offs from there, like the World Trade Organization, and WHO, which has been very controversial, the World Health Organization, and the various treaties and the various regional cooperation groups and blocs, like the Euro bloc, the European Union, ASEAN, and so on. And that school is usually styled the liberal school. So they promote a liberal international world order. And we often hear this referenced a lot. A rogue state will be pointed to, for example, by Western powers and their allies, and they will be chastised for not following a rules-based order. So when you hear that term, rules-based order, it's another name for the liberal international order. Now, I've mentioned Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher who was perhaps the greatest philosopher of the European Enlightenment, and he wrote a treatise about perpetual peace. And he believed that liberal states, those that had a sort of representative government, the kind of government that was arising in Europe at the time, and think democracy more than anything else. So if you had genuine democracies that represented the people's interests, well, people would feel that it wasn't their interests to be at war, but it would be in their interests to be involved in trading relationships with other nations. And this dovetailed quite well with the rise of the British Empire and all the ideas around trade, like free trade. There was a big movement in the 19th century for free trade. Every nation would specialise in what they were good at, and they would trade their surplus with other nations who'd be supplying their needs as well. And that if you had trade going on like this around the globe, it would be a kind of a bulwark against the threat of war, because you don't want to upset your trading relationship. You don't want to interrupt supply chains. You want to go on with life as normal. So Kant believed that given liberal democracies, a liberal international order, it would circumvent the possibility of war, and that it was not inconceivable that we could build a world where peace was perpetual, it was ongoing. Now, that was somewhat naive, I think it's fair to say. Even the liberal international world order theorists would agree that there's more to the picture than that. Wars have gone on. World order has been shattered. And every time we've tried to build treaties, whether it's the Congress of Vienna after the Napoleonic Wars, which did establish a kind of equilibrium through Europe for a century between 1815 and 1915, between, say, the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the outbreak of the First World War, where the whole system of balance of power was in tatters. With this Westphalian system, nation states need to have a certain legitimacy, and their sovereignty needs to be respected. And there is a balance of power as long as there is a balance of power, sovereign states are reluctant to initiate war. Because if you're going up against an adversary that's equally powerful and equally motivated, there's going to be a lot of mutual damage. It's a form of deterrent. And in that 19th century system, England, or the British Isles, being an island separated from the continent, could act as a balancer of power between France and Germany and Austria and Russia and so on. So the system kind of worked. Count Metternich of Austria was one of the luminaries that put that system in place. But it had its detractors, and there were people that were not with the program, and perhaps for good reason, because their peoples didn't have the same conception of international order. Bismarck, for example, had a different vision for Germany, and the Russian Tsars had a different vision for Russia and its empire. But the idea of the nation state and its importance has continued to bulk large in modern political history. And even when colonised places in Africa and Asia agitated to throw off the imperial yoke of Britain or France, let's say, they would invoke Westphalian principles to bolster their aspirations and to make their claims more compelling and intelligible to their imperial overlords. They would talk in terms of their own sovereignty and their own national independence. We want to be able to govern ourselves. Whether it's the Egyptians or the Rhodesians becoming Botswana and saying to the British, we want to govern ourselves, or the Algerians telling the French that they want to govern themselves, or the Indians who used to be under the British Raj, they would invoke this principle of sovereignty, sovereign nationhood. You be your own country and we'll be our own country. And then we'll deal with each other on a basis of equality, respecting each other's sovereignty. And we want to be able to determine our own destiny. So what's wrong with that? Well, there's nothing wrong with that. And a large portion of the world subscribes to that kind of model of how the international system works. But not the entire world. And that part of the world that doesn't subscribe to that system is growing and becoming more powerful. There's been a lot of talk in the media and online some time now about the BRICS bloc of nations, which is a huge economic bloc, which is now the most powerful economic bloc on the planet, more powerful than the G7, in fact. It controls 40% of the world's GDP and about half of its oil. And BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, Iran, China, South Africa, which were the original founding members. But now this bloc counts among its membership, I don't know, maybe 67 countries. And they all seem to want to move away from using the US dollar as the reserve currency for international transactions. And they have been striking trade deals in their own currencies, like the renminbi or the Chinese yuan and the Russian ruble. And also accumulating gold stores as well, so that they have what has always throughout history been considered real money, real wealth. And together they are formidable. Now, the three main powerhouses which are reshaping world order at the moment. And remember, world order is emergent. I mean, complete world order would be a coherent global system of order. We are moving towards it. But we are lurching towards it. There are setbacks along the way, there are hiccups. This bloc believes in a more multipolar world, not a unipolar world where there is one superpower, the United States, which basically has a prevailing hegemonic influence in institutions like the UN and NATO to more or less dictate the terms of what a liberal international order should be. So what we're seeing is that the economic basis of power is shifting. And so the political basis of power is also shifting more to a multipolar world and multilateral agreements and deals between countries where every country is its own power centre. But again, they're not all working with a Westphalian model in mind for international relations. They don't necessarily think in terms of one nation relating to another. They might speak in those terms more so than think in those terms. Let's look at the three main powerhouses in that: Russia, Iran and China. Well, Russia and China have historically had an imperial system. The Russian Tsars considered themselves the heirs of the Caesars. So there is a connection between Tsar and Caesar. And the Caesars, of course, were the Roman emperors. So the first Roman Empire was centered on Rome. The second Roman Empire was centered on Byzantium or Constantinople. That eventually fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. And then the seat of empire in the Russian worldview was transferred to the Duchy of Moscow, which regards itself as the Third Rome. And it, especially in the 19th century, this was clear. It was one of the countervailing influences to the system that was set in place by the Congress of Vienna, that system that gave Europe a basic peace, which was more or less a series of truces between 1815 and 1915. But you had the Russian Empire over there, not thinking in terms of a balance of power, but thinking more in terms of being the protector of all Christians. Of course, the Russian Orthodox Church is at the heart of its concept of Christianity. Nevertheless, it believed it had a special connection with Orthodox peoples, say living in the Balkans. What is Serbia and Bosnia, Croatia, Montenegro, Albania, that area today, what used to be called Yugoslavia, and then called something else before that, the Balkans. Lots of Orthodox there, living alongside Catholics and Muslims. And so the Russians felt they had a protective and kind of overseeing influence over those peoples. They could reach into the Ottoman Empire and have say over the lives of those peoples. They asserted that claim. When I was at school, I heard about the Crimean War, and we learnt a poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, which was set in the Crimean War, which occurred in the middle of the 19th century, in the early 1850s. But I didn't understand what it was about. And part of what it was about was Russia projecting its power into the Ottoman Empire to have say and protective influence over the lives of Orthodox living within it under the Sultan. Its effect on the balance of power, its destabilizing effect, was such that France and England teamed up with the Ottoman Turks to fight the Crimean War against Russia. The reason I bring up the example of the Crimean War, because it can illustrate that what's in conflict here is not just four nation states fighting a battle. If you try to think of it, why would France and England join up with the Turks to fight Russia? It's not just France and England and Turkey against Russia. That doesn't explain it. It's also a clash or a conflict between two conceptions of world order. Russia wants to build a universal Christian empire. That was its idea of its destiny. Whereas extend its influence as far as it could. It believed its influence was a beneficial thing in the world. Whereas France and England felt that peace was to be secured by a balance of power, and you couldn't get any one power too strong, otherwise it would upset the balance. Later on it became Germany that was too strong. That's why France and England teamed up with an Islamic power, Turkey. Now, Turkey didn't think in terms of nation states either. It was a caliphate. Because in the Islamic world, the caliph is the temporal ruler and meant to be the successor of the Prophet Muhammad. So the caliph wants to rule over all of the Muslims within a given territory that his power reaches. Caliph means successor, and we've had different caliphates through history, like the Abbasid Caliphate, which was centred on Damascus in the early days, around the middle 700s, and the Umayyad Caliphate, and later on we had the Ottoman Turks, and they continued because they controlled the Levant and into the Balkans. So those Serbs and Croats today and Albanians, they were living under the Sultan. And where there's war in the Middle East today, Israel and Gaza, they too were living under the Ottoman Empire. And they didn't conceive of themselves as a nation state. They governed diverse peoples, but with an Islamic worldview in mind. That was a challenge to a Westphalian order, and it will always be a challenge to the liberal international world order. If we just go back a decade, we see the sudden appearance of ISIS. Remember ISIS or ISIL? The Islamic State in the Levant. And they believed in a revived caliphate. That was their basic unit of order, not the nation state. That's why they didn't respect the national boundaries of Iraq and Syria and so on. Because they're not working with a Westphalian system. So it becomes very difficult to accommodate and deal with the needs and aspirations of people that are working under another system. Similarly, the Chinese, they've always had an imperial system with the Chinese capital, Peking, Beijing, at the centre, and they would have a sphere of influence. And other nations would, in a sense, want to emulate their imperial overlords. And they could participate in the superior culture of the Chinese civilization. China wanted to extend its influence because it believed, again, it was a benevolent influence and that the emperor was basically given a mandate from heaven to rule. Iran too does not think in terms of an order between nation states, an international order where sovereign nation states can agree to international agreements. Since the Iranian Revolution led by the Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979, you have had the first real Islamic republic, the first Islamist state, this fusion between religion and politics, and it's standing intransigent against a world that resists what it is that it stands for. It is Shia, it's not Sunni. Nevertheless, in Islam, there is a conception of Dar al-Islam, the house of Islam, those who live in peace and order because they have received a revelation. And then outside of that is the house of war, of chaos, all the other nations, which in Allah's good time, the Islamic Empire is meant to, I suppose, bring over to their side by demonstrating a superior way of life. Now, this looked like it was going to happen hundreds of years ago. Islam was very strong, in the 1400s when it took Constantinople, in the 1500s when it was really threatening Europe, and right through to 1683 and the siege of Vienna. And even there's a resonance between the date, sort of September 11, back in that year, the 11th, the 12th of September, 1683, when the Islamic forces, if they'd taken Vienna, would have been able to move through Europe. They didn't do it that way. Maybe through immigration. There has been an Islamification of Europe in more recent times, but it didn't happen through war. And after that time, the West, gee, isn't that a term, screaming out for definition, but the West has gained an ascendancy in weaponry and technology such that it did more subjugating of the Islamic world than the Islamic world did of it. In a way, it was a clearer, more understandable world for our grandparents living in the Cold War, living through the Cold War. The world was bipolar, two big camps. There was the free world led by the USA, and then there was the communist world led by the Soviet Union. But with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, everything was shaken up. And for a moment, it looked like free market capitalism and the US way of life was going to sweep the world, that it was the superior system, and that the whole world would basically have to fall in line behind it. Francis Fukuyama wrote of the end of history. This was going to be the end of history. Now there weren't going to be the same divisions. Again, utopian thinking. And it can happen with the best philosophers and historians, like Immanuel Kant, Fukuyama. Utopian thinking in the sense that, no, there was a lot more to world order than a simple stroke of the pen or one fell swoop solution, because different peoples have different conceptions of world order and different imaginations, different aspirations. So I know we've rambled over a lot of things in this initial video on world order, but what do I mean by world order? I mean a coherence in the governance structure of the world, And we haven't really had world order. We are approaching it in the sense that an order is emerging, and it can go to the dark side or the light side. Depends on whether the force is being abused or not. And if it goes to the dark side, it could be a terrible, surveillance state with digital ID and pandemics every few years.
Nightmare.
The sky's the limit in terms of imagining nightmarish scenarios. Or if it goes the other way, it could be an era of peace and prosperity and cultural exchange and flourishing of humanity and what makes us human, and a sense of equality for all peoples. So I'm not trying to make you afraid of emergent world order or trying to make you excited about emergent world order, but just the sheer force of history is pushing us, obviously, in this era of globalization towards a more coherent world order, and we've just got to make the best of it. And what I'm suggesting is we need to understand the different approaches to world order so that we're not naive about our expectations of what such and such an institution can do, or what following such and such a powerful country can achieve. So we'll come back and talk more about this soon.